They laughed at him while he begged on the street. But just a few hours later, they would all witness who he truly was. On a crowded corner in downtown Denver, an old man sat quietly beside a street lamp. He wore a faded military jacket, worn-out pants, and a cap with the name of the battalion he once fought for over 20 years ago. In front of him lay a worn piece of cardboard with a simple message written in black marker, veteran. Still fighting. His name was Frank. He was over 60, with deep lines on his face and eyes that seemed to stare far beyond the traffic and concrete. Every morning, he sat in the same spot, knees bent, hands resting on his lap, not begging for pity, but waiting, not for money, but for something that hadn't returned, or someone who never did. Cars sped past him. People rushed by without turning their heads. Most of them even walked faster as they approached, as if poverty might rub off on them just by locking eyes. Then came a group of teenagers. 3 boys, phones in hand, laughter loud and careless. They stopped in front of Frank and pointed a camera his way. "Look, it's our veteran actor. What's the day's role? Soldier who lost the war?" Frank said nothing. He simply looked down at the pavement. One of the teens flicked a coin, not into Frank's small donation cup, but toward his feet. It landed with a metallic clink. They laughed, loud and unkind, then walked away, leaving behind a video that would soon go viral. But Frank didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He didn't even look after them. He just closed his eyes and took a long, heavy breath. Across the street, from inside a slowing bus caught in red light, a young woman watched everything. Her name was Marissa. She had just started her job as a junior lawyer at a law firm nearby. She saw what happened and felt something stir deep inside. Not just pity, but a memory. Her grandfather had been a veteran too. That afternoon, during lunch, Marissa bought 2 pieces of warm bread and a cup of coffee. She crossed the street and walked toward Frank. Her steps were hesitant. She didn't want to come off as patronizing. But when Frank looked up and saw her, he simply nodded and said, "Thank you, miss. I hope your day is better than mine." Those words struck deep, not because of the sadness in them, but because of the quiet sincerity. As the sun lowered and the street began to empty, Frank slowly stood. He bent down, picked up his cardboard sign and his small cup, and started walking toward an alley behind an old building. That's where he usually spent the night. His steps were slow but firm, like a soldier who kept moving even when the path grew steep. He didn't know that today would be the day when everyone who once laughed at him would bow their heads. And he didn't know that the young woman who gave him coffee would become the reason he'd have to remember who he truly was. The office lights flickered as Marissa closed her laptop and grabbed her purse. It was already past 8 p.m. The rest of the firm had emptied out an hour earlier, but she had stayed behind to finish drafting a case summary. The streets outside were quieter now, and a thin layer of fog had begun to settle between the buildings. Marissa stepped outside and locked the glass door behind her. The cold hit her immediately. She pulled her coat tighter and started walking toward the bus stop, just 2 blocks away. Her heels echoed on the sidewalk as she passed a closed coffee shop and a row of darkened boutiques. She was the only one on the street, except she wasn't. Frank had returned to the alley earlier that evening. He had eaten half the bread Marissa gave him, saved the rest for later. He had just laid down on his old army sleeping mat when he heard footsteps, light, hurried, feminine. Then he heard another set, heavier, more erratic, keeping pace behind first. He stood up and peeked around the alley wall. A man in a dark hoodie was walking swiftly, too close behind a woman in a beige coat. He wasn't just walking, he was trailing, watching, waiting. Frank's instincts flared, those old reflexes buried deep under years of silence. His heartbeat quickened, not out of fear, but out of something older, something trained, something that hadn't left him, even when everything else had. Marissa reached the bus stop and checked her phone. Bus 37 to 6 minutes. She exhaled and looked around. Street lamps flickered above. Silence wrapped around her like fog. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until they were only a few feet away. The man in the hoodie slowed down just enough to make her nerves react. He circled slightly, pretending to look at the bus schedule taped to the post. His hands stayed in his pockets. His eyes never left her. Marissa's chest tightened. She took a step back, clutching her purse closer. She thought of dialing someone, but her hands trembled too much. From a shadow of the alley, Frank moved. Not fast, not loud, just enough to stay out of the man's line of sight. He stepped behind a trash bin, then slid along the side of the liquor store wall. His mind calculated distance, timing, angles. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a plan. But he had done this before, in darker places, under worse skies. His breathing slowed. His muscles tensed. He waited. The man in the hoodie took one step closer to Marissa. His right hand came out his pocket. In it, something narrow and silver. She didn't see it clearly, but Frank did, and that's when he started moving. Frank didn't run. He advanced with calculated urgency, each step deliberate, each breath silent. His boots barely touched the ground. The years had slowed him, but not dulled him. He was still a soldier underneath all that dirt. 10 feet. 7. 4. The man in the hoodie raised the object in his hand, pointing it toward Marissa's purse. His other arm reached to grab her shoulder. Marissa gasped and tried to pull away, but her legs froze. Fear gripped her like ice. That's when Frank struck. With all the force he could gather, Frank launched his shoulder into the man's side. The attacker stumbled sideways, caught completely off guard. The metal object, a box cutter, fell to the ground with sharp clink. Frank didn't stop. He tackled the man to the pavement and locked his arms around his chest. "Run!" he shouted to Marissa. "Get help!" Marissa hesitated for 1 second, her eyes wide with shock. Then she turned and sprinted across the street. Frank held on. The man thrashed beneath him, elbows flailing. One hit Frank in the ribs. Pain shot through his chest, but he clenched his jaw and tightened his grip. The instincts kicked in: leverage, weight, positioning. This wasn't a brawl. This was survival. The attacker tried to crawl away, but Frank shifted his body and trapped the man's arm beneath his knee. Blood ran from a cut on Frank's hand, but he didn't notice. What he noticed was that the attacker was breathing faster, panicking. "You're not going anywhere," Frank growled, voice low and steady. Sirens wailed in the distance. Marissa had made it to a security booth nearby and called for help. Lights flashed as the first police cruiser pulled in. Frank didn't move. He sat there, bruised and bleeding, pinning the man down with the last of his strength. The officers rushed in. "Let him go, sir, we've got him." Frank slowly lifted his hands and rolled away. The officers cuffed the attacker and hauled him up. One of them looked down at Frank and did a double take. "You're that guy," he said, "the vet from the videos." Frank didn't answer. He was too tired, too cold, too used to being overlooked. Marissa ran back across the street and dropped to her knees beside him. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Frank looked at her, eyes soft beneath the grime. "Didn't want him to take anything from you," he said. "I've had enough stolen already." The paramedics arrived and lifted Frank onto a stretcher. Marissa didn't leave his side. For the first time in years, Frank allowed himself to lean back and close his eyes, not in defeat, but in peace. He had remembered who he was. And now, so did everyone else. The next morning, Denver woke up to a different kind of headline. Homeless veteran stops violent robbery downtown. Hero on the sidewalk. The man they mocked just saved a life. News vans crowded the corner where Frank had sat for months without a single word from the public. Now, everyone wanted to know his name. Journalists spoke of bravery. Social media called him a legend. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now slowed down to stare. But Frank wasn't there. He was in a hospital bed 2 blocks away. A cracked rib, deep bruises on his shoulder. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to keep him there overnight. Marissa sat beside him. She hadn't left. She canceled her morning meetings and held his hand through the quiet hours. She had brought him fresh clothes, coffee, a toothbrush, and a phone, because someone very important wanted to talk to him. A woman from a Veteran Support Alliance had seen the footage and tracked him down. Frank didn't say much, just nodded and said, "We'll see." He didn't trust Easy anymore. Too many empty promises in the past. But Marissa believed. And this time, she said, it would be different. Back at the street corner, someone had placed flowers beside Frank's usual spot. A cardboard sign had been left behind, not by him, but by a stranger. It read, "Forgive us for not seeing you." That afternoon, the law firm where Marissa worked held a press conference. They spoke about courage, about community, and about what it meant to see someone not for where they are, but for who they are. Marissa was offered a chance to speak. Her voice trembled as she said, "He didn't ask for anything, not even thanks. But what he gave me was everything." That evening, the video of Frank tackling the attacker hit 2 million views. People recognize him now, not as the man begging by the lamppost, but as the man who stood up when no one else did. Yet Frank still didn't say much. When the hospital offered him a private room, he politely declined. When a senator's office sent flowers, he asked the nurse to give them to the children's wing. Frank didn't want fame. He just wanted quiet. But the city wasn't ready to stay quiet about him. Night fell softly over the city, but inside his hospital room, Frank lay awake, staring at the dim ceiling as the monitors beside him beeped in steady rhythm. It wasn't the pain that kept him awake. It was the memories. He hadn't felt adrenaline like that in years. The sudden clarity, the split-second choices, the same rush he used to feel halfway across the world in cities torn by war and silence. And now, all was back because of a stranger with frightened eyes and a purse. A nurse came in quietly to check his vitals. Frank gave her a small nod. "You're the man from the news," she whispered. "My father served too. He'd be proud of what you did." Frank looked away. He didn't feel like a hero. He had buried too many friends to accept that word easily. When she left, he turned his head toward the window. The skyline of Denver blinked back at him, alive, glowing, indifferent. His hand drifted to the edge of the hospital blanket, where, earlier that day, Marissa had placed something, a photograph. It was old, folded and worn. It showed a young soldier in desert fatigues, standing between two friends in front of a Humvee. The man on the right, smiling, dark hair under a helmet, that was Frank. The other two were gone now, one buried in California, the other never found. The door opened again, and Marissa stepped in with quiet footsteps. She had gone home just long enough to shower and return. She sat down beside him and offered a small paper bag. "Real food," she said, "not hospital mystery soup." Frank chuckled, a dry sound, but honest. He took the sandwich, but didn't eat. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment. "You didn't have to come back," he said. Marissa smiled. "You didn't have to save me." They sat in silence for a while. Then she leaned forward. "I want to help you, Frank. Not with charity, with choices. There are organizations, housing, trauma care, employment for vets. And this time, I'll walk with you through all of it." Frank looked down. His hands were shaking slightly. "I've walked alone a long time," he said softly. "I forgot what it's like to be seen." Outside, the city moved on as usual. But inside that room, something shifted. Not loudly, just enough to be felt. 2 days after the incident, Frank was discharged from the hospital. He walked out slowly, wearing a clean flannel shirt, jeans that didn't sag at the knees, and an old army cap Marissa had washed for him. He still moved with caution, one hand on the railing, the other clutching a small paper bag with his medications. But his steps were his own. Waiting outside wasn't a cab. It was Marissa. She stood by the curb with her car door open, and her smile was the kind you can't fake. Frank hesitated. Then he nodded and got in. As they drove through the city, he noticed things differently. The people on the sidewalks, the way some of them glanced at him, then did a double take. A woman even waved as they passed. A man at a red light tapped the roof of his car in a small salute. Frank didn't know what to do with it. He wasn't used to being noticed unless someone needed a reason to laugh. They arrived back at the same intersection. His corner, the one with the crooked lamppost and the cracked pavement. It looked the same, but something was different. A small group stood there, 2 mothers with strollers, a man with a briefcase, and 3 students. They had gathered around a candle. A bouquet of sunflowers lay at the base of the pole, and next to it, a photo of Frank, printed from the viral video. taped to a cardboard backing. Above it, someone had written in bold black marker, "Hero doesn't always wear medals." Frank stayed in the car, silent. Marissa didn't push. After a while, he finally opened the door and stepped out. The air hit him like memory. He walked slowly toward the gathering. People turned to look. Some clapped. A child handed him a drawing of a soldier with a cape. Frank stared at the photo taped to the post. Then he looked at the sign. Then at the people. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he didn't feel out of place. Marissa stood beside him. "There's a housing program downtown," she said quietly. "Veteran-only units. Safe, clean, respectful." Frank nodded, still looking ahead. "I'll go," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "But not alone." Later that evening, a news reporter asked Frank if he had anything he wanted to say to the city. He thought about it, then simply said, "I never stopped serving. I just ran out of places to serve." 3 weeks passed. Frank now lived in a small studio unit provided by a veteran housing program downtown. It wasn't much, just a bed, a desk, and a window that faced the alleyway. But it had a lock, hot water, and silence, the kind of silence he could choose. Every morning, he woke up and brewed coffee, real coffee, not the instant kind. He would sit by the window, watching the street wake up, and every morning, without fail, someone would wave to him from the sidewalk below. He was no longer invisible. Marissa helped him set up a bank account, apply for his veteran medical benefits, and get back in touch with the Veteran Brotherhood, a volunteer corps made up of former servicemen who helped build shelters, run soup kitchens, and assist fellow vets adjusting to civilian life. Frank didn't say it out loud, but he liked the idea. He liked being useful. He liked being needed. On his first day volunteering at a mobile food stand run by the Brotherhood, Frank wore a clean black T-shirt and tucked his cap low over his eyes. He handed out bowls of chili and small bread rolls, one by one. Most people didn't recognize him, until one man did. "Wait, you're the guy who tackled that mugger, right?" Frank just nodded. The man stuck out his hand. "You saved someone. You reminded us not to ignore people just because they're quiet." Later that afternoon, one of the local news anchors stopped by the food stand to shoot a follow-up segment. She asked Frank the same question others had. "Why did you do it? What made you jump in?" Frank stirred a pot of chili and answered without turning around. "Because I knew what would happen if I didn't." The anchor blinked, surprised by the simplicity. After the segment aired, donations poured into the shelter. More volunteers signed up, and Frank was offered something he never expected, a paid position as an operations assistant with regular hours and health benefits. That night, back in his apartment, Frank looked at himself in the mirror, not at the wrinkles, not at the gray, but at the steadiness, at the man who had once been discarded by the world and who now carried something again, responsibility, purpose, and a quiet, steady dignity. 3 months after the attack, Frank had become a quiet fixture in the city's growing network of outreach programs. He worked 5 days a week at the shelter, managing supplies, helping with intake forms, even training younger volunteers how to calmly defuse tension with dignity, not force. Every now and then, a reporter would ask for an interview. He declined most, not out of pride, but peace. He had finally found something resembling rhythm. But sometimes peace invites challenge. It was a cold Tuesday evening when the test came. Frank had just finished locking up the back door of the shelter when he noticed something down the alley. A figure, small, quick, hunched, was rifling through one of the donation boxes they kept for the overnight van. He walked toward the shadow without raising his voice. As he stepped closer, he saw it was a boy, maybe 12, maybe 13. Thin, dirt on his cheek, coat 2 sizes too big. Frank didn't yell. He just said, "Are you hungry?" The boy froze, looked up, then turned and bolted. But Frank had seen that look before, too many times. It wasn't guilt. It was survival. The next morning, Frank asked around. He checked the cameras, asked the other volunteers. Turns out, the boy had been seen twice before, always near closing, never stealing much, just small things. gloves, crackers, soap. Marissa happened to stop by that day. Frank told her what happened. She looked at him and said gently, "What are you going to do if he comes back?" Frank didn't answer immediately, but that night, he left a small bag by the donation bin. Inside, socks, a sandwich, and a note. "If you need help, not just food, come inside. F." 3 nights passed. Then 4. On the 5th night, the bag was gone. No footprints. No sign of the boy. But Frank kept leaving another. Then another. On the 7th night, someone knocked on the shelter's side door just before midnight. Frank opened it, and the boy stood there, silent, holding the note in both hands. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just didn't run. Frank stepped aside. "Come in, son. It's warm in here." The door closed behind them with a soft click. No noise. No fanfare. Just a man who had once been discarded, offering safety to someone the world hadn't noticed yet. It wasn't heroism. It was instinct. Winter deepened in Denver. Snow lined the streets, and the wind pressed against windows like a long, steady breath. Inside the shelter, heaters hummed low and steady. The scent of stew hung in the air, and laughter, quiet, respectful laughter, rose from tired voices finding warmth. Frank moved between tables, checking on coats and gloves, making sure the coffee pot stayed full. No one saluted him. No one asked for a selfie. But everyone nodded when he passed. Everyone knew. The boy from the alley, his name was Caleb, had come back every night since. He never said much, but he helped. He swept the floors. He watched Frank's every move like a student watches a teacher who doesn't know he's teaching. Frank didn't push, didn't pry. He simply let Caleb be. And when the boy finally asked if he could stay past curfew one night to help sort the donations, Frank simply said, "Only if you eat first." Caleb smiled for the first time that night. It was barely a smile, but it was real. One evening in late December, the mayor of Denver visited the shelter unannounced. She wore no camera, brought no press. She simply sat across from Frank at a folding table and said, "You change how the city sees its veterans and how we see our responsibilities." Frank stirred his coffee, quiet for a moment. "I didn't change the city," he said. "I just reminded it to look closer." As the year came to a close, the shelter held a small event for volunteers and regulars. There were no speeches, just food and music. Marissa arrived late, but when she saw Frank in the corner, smiling, talking, alive, she paused at the door and just watched. She remembered the first time she saw him, the cardboard sign, the mocking laughter, the silence he carried like a shadow. And now, this man, the one they all ignored, was the steady center of something bigger than recognition. He was safety. He was legacy. Later that night, as the lights dimmed and the chairs were folded, Frank stood outside beneath the street lamp, the same one he used to sit under, the same corner. But everything was different now. A passing bus slowed. A rider tapped the glass in quiet acknowledgement. Frank didn't wave. He just stood tall, not in uniform, but in service. The world hadn't given him much, but he had given something back anyway. And in doing so, he had reclaimed the one thing no one can mock, buy, or steal: his name.